They laughed at his impossible shot until he destroyed a tank 2.6 miles out. March 18, 1945, near Remagen, Germany. The morning began before sunrise, with a pale gray light spreading across the Rhine Valley. A thin mist hung over the fields, wrapping itself around barns, collapsed stone walls, and the abandoned farmhouses that dotted the slopes near Remagen. The ground remained damp from the night's drizzle, and every step the American infantry took pressed water up through the grass. By 6:40, elements of the U.S. 9th Infantry Division were moving east of the Ludendorff Bridge, attempting to widen the recently secured foothold. The bridgehead had become one of the most heavily contested zones in Germany. Every yard gained forced the German army to respond with greater intensity. But on that particular morning, the advance stopped abruptly. The first shell arrived without warning, a sharp, echoing blast somewhere up the valley. Seconds later, a second round followed, striking the front corner of an M10 tank destroyer and sending chunks of metal and soil into the air. The crew bailed out immediately, coughing and dragging each other away from the vehicle as smoke drifted upward. Men shouted for cover. Medics ran toward the wounded. Officers tried to locate the source of the fire, but no one could see anything. The third shell confirmed it. The Germans had positioned a tank on high ground overlooking the entire approach. Infantrymen flattened themselves against the earth, shielding their heads as the explosion shook the ground. The shelling didn't come in rapid bursts. Instead, each round landed with deliberate spacing, measured, precise, confident. Whoever was operating that German gun understood exactly how to control a battlefield. Over the next 20 minutes, 2 more vehicles were disabled. A half-track burned near an apple orchard, and an ammunition trailer detonated in a violent burst that sent fragments buzzing over the heads of nearby soldiers. The Americans could not move forward. They could not flank. They could barely lift their heads high enough to see more than a few meters ahead. The Panther, though no one knew which model it was yet, sat completely concealed somewhere across the valley. Its firing position exploited the rolling terrain perfectly. The distance was far enough that its muzzle flash barely registered through the fog, and the tank itself remained invisible behind thick seasonal brush and the remnants of a collapsed stone retaining wall. By 7:10, a decision was made. The battalion would hold in place until their own armor could advance. Orders were passed quietly through squads. The goal was simple: survive until reinforcements arrived. And yet, among the scattered groups of infantry, one figure was already preparing to break that pattern. Private Elias Mercer crouched behind what remained of a farmhouse wall. The wall had once supported a roof, but the roof had been torn apart during earlier fighting. Now it stood as a jagged barrier of stone and timber, offering just enough protection for someone willing to press themselves close to the ground. Elias kept his face calm. His uniform was already dusted with dried mud. His helmet sat low on his brow, shadowing his eyes. What distinguished him from the rest wasn't fearlessness. Everyone felt fear, even the veterans, but a particular kind of focus. He watched the ridgeline through the scope of an experimental M1944 long-range rifle, a weapon few people in the Army had even heard of. His spotter, Corporal Daniel Hensley, crawled up beside him with binoculars pressed against his chest. "They're saying it's a Panther," Daniel murmured. "Somewhere on the East Ridge. No one's getting eyes on it." Elias didn't speak immediately. He followed the ridgeline slowly, his breathing steady and measured. The distant ground blurred from fog, then sharpened again when the sun briefly broke through. It wasn't just the chaos of the battlefield that drove him. It was the knowledge that every minute the tank remained operational, more men would die needlessly. Crews were pinned down. Medics were exposed. Entire squads were stranded behind low ridges with no clear route to withdraw. Elias lifted his head from the scope just long enough to gauge the wind brushing across the grass. He had already identified a possible firing solution. Another German shell detonated several hundred meters behind them, closer this time, scattering roof tiles across the dirt. Men yelled again, ducking instinctively. Daniel whispered, "We should wait for the Shermans." Command said, Elias interrupted quietly, without raising his voice. If we wait, they're going to keep firing. They know exactly where we are. Daniel watched him for a moment. He knew Elias wasn't reckless. He also knew that once Elias recognized the target, he didn't abandon the attempt. Elias went back to the scope. There, just for a moment, a faint glimmer where sunlight struck metal through a break in the foliage. That was enough to tell him he was looking at more than empty brush. The infantry around them remained pressed against the ground, unable to move. The lines had stopped moving not because soldiers lacked courage, but because someone on the far ridge had the upper hand. Elias lowered the scope again. His voice was steady. "I've got the direction. It's far, a lot farther than anything we've shot before." Daniel stared at him. "How far?" Elias didn't answer yet. He was still calculating, still listening to the subtle sound of wind shifting, still watching for the faint smoke trails that revealed the tank's breathing spaces between shots. Finally, he said, "More than 2 miles." Daniel blinked. "That's impossible." Elias lifted the rifle slightly, checking the stability of the bipod. "Maybe, but we don't have another option." The battalion remained pinned. The Germans showed no intention of letting them advance. Armor reinforcements were hours away. Someone had to try something unconventional. And on that fog-bound morning outside Remagen, the quiet soldier with the experimental rifle began preparing for a shot no one in his unit believed could be made. A shot that, if it failed, would reveal their position instantly. A shot that, if it succeeded, could change the entire day. Elias Mercer settled into the dirt, letting it mold around his elbows. The narrator's voice softens. This was the moment the story truly began. Not with heroism, not with bravado, but with one soldier deciding that the next move on the battlefield belonged to him. Before the war, Elias Mercer lived a life that rarely drew attention. He grew up on a small ranch outside Colorado Springs, surrounded by open land that stretched farther than the eye could comfortably judge. His family wasn't wealthy, but they owned enough cattle to stay afloat. Work began early, ended late, and revolved around a rhythm older than the town itself. Elias didn't talk much. He listened. He observed. And when he carried a rifle, he handled it with the kind of quiet familiarity that came from years of necessity rather than hobby. At 14, he became responsible for protecting the herd from coyotes and the occasional stray wolf. His father trusted him with a single-shot Winchester. Elias quickly learned the terrain, how distance played tricks on the eyes, how heat bent the image of the ground, how wind changed its behavior between one ridge and the next. He didn't call these observations technique. They were simply part of the land. When America entered the war, Elias enlisted like thousands of others. He was neither eager nor reluctant. He believed that when a country was under threat, a citizen should do what he could. Yet his first months in the army didn't go smoothly. During basic training, his quiet nature was misread as hesitation. Several instructors wrote that he lacked aggression and command presence. He was nearly assigned to a supply company until one range officer noticed something unusual. At every distance, in every wind condition, Elias's shots formed a pattern tighter than expected for someone with no prior military training. The officer requested additional tests. The results pushed Elias toward the Army's small but growing precision marksmanship program. Still, even among the sharpshooters, he stood apart. Most men talked proudly about their scores or argued about preferred rifles. Elias simply wanted to understand the equipment in his hands. He cleaned every weapon meticulously. He disassembled optical sights until he understood their smallest imperfections. He spent hours studying wind flags long after official training ended. It was during this period that he first encountered the rifle that would later define his service. An early prototype of the M1944 long-range trial model, a weapon the Ordnance Department considered experimental. Only a few units reached the front for field testing, each paired with a soldier who had the patience to learn its quirks. The rifle looked oversized, with an extended barrel and a thickened chamber designed for high-pressure loads. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't practical. Some soldiers joked it belonged in a laboratory. Others claimed the optic was too fragile for combat. Elias didn't dismiss it. He He simply wanted to know how far it could truly reach. That's where Corporal Daniel Hawk Hensley entered his life. Daniel was everything Elias wasn't: talkative, confident, and always ready with a story about hunting in the Appalachian Mountains. He had spent years tracking deer across steep ridges, gaining an instinctive feel for terrain and bullet travel. When assigned as Elias's spotter, he initially wondered how the partnership would work. Elias rarely initiated conversation. Daniel never stopped. Their personalities clashed at first, but operational results dissolved any friction. Daniel soon realized that Elias saw shooting as a problem-solving exercise, not a contest. And Elias recognized that Daniel's terrain instincts and quick observation filled gaps he couldn't cover alone. The pair built a rhythm. During training evaluations, Daniel would quietly say, "Wind's pushing off the right slope," and Elias adjusted before the sentence was even finished. When they were deployed to Europe in 1944, they brought the experimental rifle with them, a weapon few officers trusted, but none were willing to discard. Its potential was unclear, but in encounters across France and Belgium, it produced results that raised eyebrows. Nothing miraculous, nothing record-breaking, but consistently accurate at ranges slightly beyond what standard rifles offered. By early 1945, word had spread informally through their battalion. If a position needed to be watched, send Mercer. If a distant machine gun nest needed harassment, call Mercer. If someone claimed a target was too far, Daniel would laugh and gesture toward Elias without explanation. Yet, even with these small successes, the two men remained largely unknown outside their unit. They didn't boast. They didn't petition for recognition. They simply followed orders. But the morning at Remagen was different. From behind the farmhouse ruins, Daniel studied the ridge through his binoculars, lowering them only to wipe the lenses free of moisture. "Elias, that's a long way out," he said. "Too long for what we're carrying." Elias didn't respond immediately. He was watching the tree-line again, tracking the faintest signs: disturbed birds, drifting smoke, slight flashes barely visible through fog. Daniel continued, "Even if you spot it, even if you get the angle perfect, nobody hits a tank from that range." Still nothing from Elias. Not defiance, not irritation, just concentration. Daniel exhaled and added quietly, "They're saying the Panthers already taken out 2 M10s. If that's true, it's a veteran crew. They know exactly what they're doing up there." Elias lifted his head slightly from a scope. "A good crew doesn't fire randomly," he said. "That means the next shot is already planned. If we don't interfere, they'll fire again soon." Daniel hesitated. He understood the logic, but the distance still seemed unrealistic. "Elias, the rifle wasn't designed for this." Elias checked the stability of the bipod, then the elevation dial, adjusting it to its upper limit. Neither was the situation. Those were the closest words Elias ever came to admitting doubt. Around them, soldiers stayed low behind rocks, trees, vehicle wrecks, waiting for someone else to change their fate. Elias didn't see himself as that person. He simply recognized that a threat existed and that he was holding the only tool that might reach it. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't confidence. It was obligation. A quiet one. A simple one. But one he accepted without negotiation. Daniel finally settled beside him, opening his range notebook. "All right," he murmured. "If we're doing this, let's do it right." And with that, the man the Army nearly assigned to supply duty prepared to attempt a shot that would challenge the limits of every rifle on the European front. The German tank that halted the American advance did not arrive by accident. Records from post-war interviews indicate that the Panther had taken position on the eastern ridge sometime before midnight. The crew belonged to a fragmented element of the 11th Panzergrenadier Division, retreating eastward after heavy losses around the Rhine. Their orders were simple: delay the Americans for as long as possible to give engineers time to reorganize defensive lines deeper inland. The tank commander, Feldwebel Rudolf Keeler, was a veteran with nearly 2 years of frontline experience. His gunner, Oberstfreiter Karl Wenzel, had proven himself repeatedly during engagements in Normandy and later in the Ardennes. The loader and driver were younger, but disciplined, trained to work quickly in narrow, dark spaces where seconds could determine survival. They selected the ridge because of its shape, a natural firing platform created by a slight rise followed by a descending slope concealed under thick brush. Broken stone from an old retaining wall provided additional cover, while fallen branches and netting helped break up the panther's outline. Before dawn, Wenzel adjusted the gun elevation and scanned the valley through the optics. The temperature was cold enough to reduce mirage, giving him a clear view of the western fields. When the Americans began moving after sunrise, he recognized the opportunity immediately. They were exposed. They were close enough to hit, but too far to respond effectively. His first shot, aimed at the leading destroyer, confirmed their advantage. Inside the tank, the atmosphere remained methodical. No shouting, no panic, just the routine of a trained crew performing their tasks. Wenzel watched the next American vehicle shift position and fired again. He made small corrections between shots, controlling recoil, keeping the barrel aligned with minimal wasted movement. Each shell sent an echo rolling down the valley, drifting over ruined barns and leafless trees. From Elias Mercer's position behind the collapsed farmhouse wall, the muzzle flash appeared only as a faint, brief disturbance, almost invisible through distance and fog. The panther might as well have been part of the ridge itself. Daniel Hensley lowered his binoculars. "I can't see the tank," he said. "Just flashes. Nothing solid." Elias didn't reply. He shifted slightly, pressing his cheek more firmly against the stock to stabilize his perspective. He waited for another shot, knowing that the Panther crew would maintain their rhythm. Down the slope, medics carried a wounded gunner behind a stack of crates. A platoon sergeant shouted for his men to keep their heads down. Steel fragments still clattered across the ground from the most recent explosion. The battlefield had become quiet in a specific way, the quiet that follows when no one believes they can safely move. Elias watched the ridge again, but he wasn't looking for the tank's outline. He was looking for anything out of place. During training, he learned that at extreme range, the target itself was rarely visible. The environment around it revealed more than the object. A moment later, he saw it. A brief reflection, not bright, not obvious, but enough to distinguish metal from foliage. It came from the left side of the ridge, near a depression where brush had been pulled aside. He exhaled slowly. That was the first confirmation. Daniel adjusted his position beside him. "Did you see something?" Elias nodded once. A glint, right edge of the tree line, near a gap in the brush. Daniel raised his binoculars again, scanning carefully. "Still can't wait." There. Something moved. Hard to tell what. Elias didn't lift his head. He remained locked onto the location through the scope, studying how the fog drifted in the background. Even the smallest disruptions in the pattern mattered. Inside the Panther, Wenzel prepared his next shot. The loader inserted a high-explosive round. Keeler observed the valley. The driver kept the engine idling low, ready to reposition if needed. The tank had no reason to move. The Americans had given them no threat. But the ridge concealed something they couldn't see. A soldier lying prone behind rubble, adjusting for wind, making corrections on a weapon most of the German army didn't even know existed. Elias finally spoke. "I think I know where the gun is." Daniel lowered the binoculars. "You think or you know?" Elias kept watching the ridge. "I know." Daniel exhaled, recognizing the tone. Elias only spoke with that level of finality when he was certain. The Panther fired another shell. The blast illuminated part of the ridge for a fraction of a second. Through the shockwave and smoke, Elias caught the faintest movement of branches shaking, the recoil clearing away loose debris. That confirmed the exact location. Elias shifted the rifle slightly, making a micro-adjustment to center the target area in his optic. He couldn't see the tank's body, but he no longer needed to. The muzzle position gave him everything required. Daniel looked at the elevation dial on Elias's scope. "Range is still extreme," he said quietly. "More than 2 miles." Elias's breathing remained steady. "Distance doesn't matter if I know the point of origin." Daniel stared at him for several seconds. "You're actually considering it." Elias answered without emotion. "If someone doesn't stop them, they'll keep firing until command pulls us back." Daniel looked across the valley again. The smoke columns, the immobilized vehicles, the men lying flat and waiting for the next shell. The situation had reached a point where no conventional response was available. So he nodded once. All right, let's set the firing platform. The narrator's voice lowers. On that ridge, the Panther crew continued their routine, unaware that a single soldier in the valley was preparing to challenge them from a distance beyond what most armies believe possible. The area behind the ruined farmhouse offered the only stable ground high enough to set a firing platform. The roof had collapsed weeks earlier from artillery impact, leaving the interior filled with broken beams, shattered tiles, and compacted soil. Elias and Daniel crawled inside the structure, using the debris like natural cover as they moved deeper toward a section of flooring that had remained intact. Daniel scanned the surroundings. No movement from the Germans. No fresh muzzle flash yet. Only the faint creaking of trees shifting in the valley wind. We'll use that beam, Daniel said, pointing to a section of timber thick enough to support a rifle. If we angle it right, it'll hold steady. Elias nodded. He began clearing the dust and loose debris from the surface, ensuring the rifle's bipod would have stable contact. Every small vibration mattered at this distance. Daniel laid his field jacket across the beam to prevent slippage. Outside, the infantry remained pinned. No one attempted to run or reposition. The German gunner had demonstrated enough accuracy that movement over more than a few meters risked immediate retaliation. The two M10s remained smoking wrecks, their hulls still radiating heat. The smell of burnt metal drifted over the valley. The Panther's crew had inflicted enough damage to halt an entire battalion. Elias extended the rifle's bipod, tested its weight distribution, and lowered himself into a prone position. His body aligned with the rifle in a straight line, reducing recoil deviation. He adjusted the butt plate until it rested firmly against his shoulder. Daniel crouched beside him and opened his range notebook. Elevation dials maxed at your last line, he said. I know, Elias replied. The rifle's optic was not designed for such distances. Its elevation adjustment ran out long before the necessary arc was achieved. Elias compensated by raising the rifle slightly and calculating the holdover manually, a technique they had practiced but never used in combat at this scale. Daniel pulled out a small wind gauge, a simple strip of cloth tied to a piece of wire. Winds shifting left, he reported. Slow, steady. Not gusting. Elias adjusted his aim, shifting the reticle several marks to the right of the target area. He watched the ridge. Still no muzzle flash. Daniel quickly recalculated. Distance estimate, 4,600 yards. Maybe a little more. That's past anything we've ever tested. Elias didn't respond. His breathing slowed. He tracked the topography, the way the ground rose and fell, the curvature of the valley, and the pattern of the fog drifting upward. Long-range shooting at this level relied less on seeing the target and more on understanding the space between shooter and objective. Another American soldier approached quietly, crouching low. Command wants to know what you two are doing, he whispered. Daniel answered without looking away from the ridge. Trying to deal with their tank. The soldier frowned. With that, it's too far. They're saying wait for armor. Daniel gestured at the burning M10s. Armor didn't fare too well. No further questions followed. The soldier backed away cautiously, realizing the conversation was already over. Elias settled deeper into position. His elbows pressed firmly into the dirt, and his cheek welded to the stock. He inhaled once, then exhaled. The world narrowed to the distance between him and the faint glimmer he had identified earlier. Daniel steadied his binoculars. If you miss, we relocate immediately, he said. If I miss, Elias replied softly, they'll know someone can see them. They both understood what that meant. A missed shot risked revealing their general direction. The Panther crew would pivot, scan for the source, and fire. The farmhouse might not withstand a direct hit. The next muzzle flash appeared. It was brief. A sharp burst of orange filtered through fog. The Panther fired toward a cluster of American infantry. The explosion shook the valley floor. Daniel whispered urgently, There! Same location as before. That's your reference. Elias made a micro adjustment to his aim. He counted silently. Then he squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired with a deep, resonant report that echoed inside the ruined farmhouse. Dust fell from the overhead beams. The muzzled blast rolled out across the valley, blending briefly with the fading echo of the panther's last shot. The bullet began its long, arcing path across nearly 2.5 miles of open terrain. For several seconds, nothing happened. Daniel searched through his binoculars, sweeping the ridge, waiting for any sign of impact. I can't see, hold on. A faint disturbance appeared near the panther's firing position. Not an explosion, just a brief spark, followed by a minor shake of branches. Daniel lowered the binoculars slightly. You hit something, he said quietly. Not the hull, but something. Elias remained silent. He was already adjusting for the second shot. The narrator's voice deepens. The first round confirmed the math. The next round would test the rifle. The third would determine whether an entire battalion remained pinned or gained the ability to move forward again. Elias recentered the reticle, made a fractional correction for wind drift, and prepared to fire again. Outside, the valley remained frozen in expectation. The gamble had begun. The second shot left the rifle with the same deep, controlled recoil as the first, but this time Elias adjusted more confidently. The dust column that rose from the beam was smaller. The position had settled. His breathing remained steady, unaffected by the tension that built around him. Daniel tracked the bullet's path through binoculars, though at this distance, he could see nothing more than the disturbance it caused upon arrival. For several long seconds, the ridge remained motionless. Then something changed. A small puff of dust lifted near the panther's hull. Not large, not forceful, but unmistakably the impact of a high-velocity, round-striking metal. Daniel leaned forward, refocused, and whispered, "You tagged the upper structure, left of the cupola." Inside the tank, the effect was immediate. The bullet had not penetrated the panther's armor, but it struck the area near the turret ring, a critical point where armor plating met mechanical components. The impact sent a shock through the bearings. Metal fragments ricocheted inside the housing. The turret, previously smooth in motion, jammed mid-rotation. Commander Keeler called for a status update. Wenzel, the gunner, struggled with the traverse controls, feeling the turret resisting his input. He lifted his head slightly from the optics, sensing that something had gone wrong even before he saw it. "Traverse is sticking," he reported. The loader paused. The driver leaned back to listen. Keeler demanded, "Can you correct it?" Wenzel attempted again. The turret shifted 2 degrees, then locked completely. A sound like grinding metal echoed inside the tank. Unmistakable, unwelcome, and dangerous. "No movement," Wenzel said. "Something's damaged." The crew exchanged quick glances. A jammed turret turned the Panther into a static gun platform. Against a concealed threat, this was a severe liability. Elias chambered a third round without speaking. He had not celebrated the impact. He had not shifted position. His calmness came from years of shooting on open plains where emotion played no role in precision. Daniel steadied his binoculars again. "If you're hitting what I think you're hitting," he said, "you're disabling their ability to aim." Elias didn't respond. He simply aligned the reticle for another correction. He squeezed the trigger. The third shot struck the Panther's engine deck. This impact created a reaction far more visible than the previous two. A thin, controlled plume of smoke rose from the rear access grills. Not a fire, not an explosion, but a sign that hot metal fragments had compromised the ventilation system. Inside the tank, the driver reacted first. "Smoke from the engine compartment," he shouted. Keeler ordered immediate repositioning. They attempted to back out of the camouflaged nook, but without turret control, the tank's firing arc was limited to a narrow field. The crew knew they were now vulnerable to any threat that could reach them. The Panther lurched backward, crushing branches and rubble. As it rolled, more smoke seeped from the rear, joining the cold morning air in a slow upward drift. From the valley floor, American soldiers watched the unusual movement. One infantryman whispered, "They're pulling back, something's wrong with it." Another answered. What hit them? Only Daniel and Elias understood the answer. As the panther reversed into clearer view, Daniel lowered his binoculars fully, stunned by what he was witnessing. Elias, they're evacuating. The tank came to a halt. The commander opened the hatch. Smoke drifted around him as he signaled for the crew to bail. One by one, the Germans climbed out, dropping to the ground and running toward cover deeper in the woods. Elias watched through the scope, expression unchanged. In a final gesture of survival, the Panther's engine sputtered, then went silent. The smoke rising from his ventilation grills became thicker, darker, and more continuous. Within minutes, flames licked upward from inside the engine housing. The tank had been forced out of the fight, and the valley, for the first time in nearly 2 hours, grew quiet. The infantry nearest to Elias remained frozen, unsure whether the threat was truly neutralized. They stared up at the ridge, watching the black smoke rising like a signal that the immediate danger had ended. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower than before. That tank isn't shooting again today. Elias lowered his rifle, his muscles relaxing for the first time since dawn. Good, he said quietly. That's all we needed. He didn't smile. He didn't stand up. He just exhaled, letting the tension leave his body in a slow, controlled release. The narrator's tone settles. The battalion wouldn't learn the details until later. How the shot crippled the turret, how the second strike damaged the venting, how the crew had no choice but to abandon their position. But in that moment, all that mattered was simple. The ridge had gone silent. The men in the valley could finally lift their heads again. The impossible had happened, but Elias saw only as a necessary solution. News of the disabled Panther spread through the battalion in waves, carried first by the infantry who had witnessed the strange sequence of events from their shallow positions. Soldiers peeked cautiously over rubble and broken stone, confirming for themselves that the tank was no longer firing. Some stared in disbelief at the plume of smoke rising steadily from the ridge. Others exchanged brief comments, unsure whether to trust their own observations. Within minutes, platoon leaders were reporting upward through radio channels. Enemy tank appears neutralized. No movement from the turret. Crew evacuated. Position abandoned. The company commander approached Elias and Daniel's position, ducking under a shattered doorway and stepping over debris. His tone was not celebratory. It was simply direct. Which one of you took that shot? Daniel answered first. Mercer did. 3 rounds. The commander looked at Elias, who remained prone beside the rifle, still monitoring the ridge in case of deception. What range? The officer asked. Daniel hesitated before replying. Approximately 4,600 yards. The commander didn't respond immediately. He seemed to evaluate the claim, measuring its feasibility against everything he understood about infantry weapons. Eventually, he spoke in a neutral voice. Engineers and reconnaissance will confirm. For now, well done. He stepped back outside to resume coordinating movement. Daniel lowered himself into a sitting position, stretching his cramped legs. They're not going to believe it, he said. Elias lifted the rifle slightly to clear dust from the ejection port, then secured the bolt. Doesn't matter if they believe it, he said. The tank's gone. American units cautiously advanced several hundred yards as the morning continued. Engineers moved ahead to inspect the Panther and secure the ridge. When they reached the tank, they found exactly what Elias had predicted: a jammed turret, a damaged vent housing, and clear bullet impact marks on areas that matched long-distance shots. A technical sergeant who examined the tank later remarked, "Whatever hit, it wasn't artillery. Too clean, too focused. This came from a rifle." The statement circulated informally through the ranks. Back at the farmhouse, Elias and Daniel waited for updated orders. Neither spoke much. They simply sat against the wall, conserving their strength. A medic passed nearby and paused just long enough to glance at the rifle. "Was that really you two?" he asked. Daniel nodded. The medic shook his head in quiet astonishment. "Never seen anything like it." He continued down the path toward wounded soldiers who still needed evacuation. Elias eventually stood, stretching stiffness from his shoulders. Daniel watched him for a moment before saying, You know what you did today is going to follow you. Elias looked down at the rifle for a long second. I don't need it to follow me, he said. I just needed it to work. Daniel understood the sentiment. Elias was not interested in recognition. His focus returned always to the immediate task, the men who needed help, the threat that needed stopping, the duty placed on their unit. Later that afternoon, an operations officer arrived to collect a brief report. The officer asked standard procedural questions: number of shots, adjustments used, visibility conditions. Elias answered each with the same quiet clarity he displayed during combat. The officer wrote the details but paused before leaving. If this is accurate, he said, it might be one of the longest confirmed hits of the war. Elias didn't respond. He didn't consider the possibility relevant. He closed the notebook on his knee and looked back toward the ridge, now quiet and marked only by a burned-out tank shell silhouetted against the late-day haze. The sun lowered slowly behind the western hills, casting long shadows across the valley. The men finally moved with confidence, reassured that no additional shells would come from the ridge. To the soldiers who had been pinned for hours, the silence felt like relief. To Elias, it felt like completion. He returned to his duties without further discussion, carrying the rifle as casually as if it had not changed the course of an entire morning. The narrator's voice settles. Elias Mercer never recorded the exact moment as a personal achievement. He did not frame it as anything extraordinary. But the men who survived because of that shot knew it altered the battlefield in a single instant. And although the Army would spend weeks debating the details, those who were present had no doubt about what happened or who made it happen. By early April 1945, the German defensive line west of the Rhine had collapsed beyond repair. Town after town surrendered or fell under Allied control. Bridges were destroyed. Road networks were disrupted. Units that had once been organized divisions were now scattered groups retreating eastward, unable to regroup under the weight of continuous pressure. Elias Mercer and Corporal Daniel Hensley continued operating with their battalion as it advanced deeper into Germany. Most days were spent clearing small towns, securing crossroads, or providing overwatch along open terrain. Their roles shifted constantly depending on what each situation required. The experimental rifle traveled everywhere with them. Mechanics inspected it once, but found nothing unusual aside from minor stress marks around the bipod hinge. Elias kept it in working order with careful maintenance, cleaning it at the end of every day regardless of how many rounds he fired. The men in their company, however, never saw the rifle the same way again. When they passed Elias during a march, they gave quiet nods. When they dug in for the night, someone occasionally asked Daniel to retell the events of the ridge, not with excitement, but with the tone of soldiers trying to understand something they had not witnessed before. Most of them had seen tanks destroyed at close range or by artillery, but none had seen a tank disabled from miles away by 3 rifle shots. And while the Army never made an official announcement, the story circulated in battalion logs and briefing rooms. A few officers discussed it in private. A captain from another regiment remarked, "If the distance is accurate, it's beyond anything we've documented." An ordnance specialist countered, "Then the equipment needs to be tested again." But the war's rapid progression left little time for formal evaluation. Elias himself never brought up the incident unless directly questioned. When asked about the range, he gave the same small shrug. It was far, but the shot was necessary. He didn't analyze it further. By mid-April, the battalion reached a small industrial town whose residents had already surrendered to avoid unnecessary fighting. As the American column moved through the streets, children watched quietly from behind doorways. Some women carried white sheets as improvised signals of non-resistance. For Elias, the change in atmosphere was significant. The thunder of artillery was distant. The movement of tanks was steady but cautious. It was clear the war was nearing its end. During a brief pause in the advance, Daniel sat beside him on a ration crate. "When this is over, what are you planning to do?" he asked. Elias considered the question, not because he lacked an answer, but because he rarely thought beyond the immediate responsibilities of the day. "Go back to Colorado," he said. "Work the ranch." Quiet things. Daniel nodded. Makes sense. After everything, quiet sounds like a good plan. The conversation ended there. It reflected the simplicity with which Elias viewed his role. He had fought because he believed he should. He had taken difficult shots because circumstances required it. But he did not see the war as a path to recognition. When Germany surrendered in early May, the battalion received orders to secure their area of responsibility and await reassignment. Some men celebrated. Others wrote letters. Many simply slept for long stretches, exhausted from months of tension. Elias cleaned his rifle one final time before it was collected by ordnance personnel for evaluation. He handed it over without ceremony. The clerk who accepted it studied the serial number and said, "This one's been making the rounds in our reports." Elias just nodded. He didn't mention the ridge or the panther. He didn't mention the calculations or the pressure or the silence after the final shot. Those details belonged to the moment and to the men who were there. When his discharge came through, he boarded a transport headed west. Daniel planned to return to the Appalachian region. They shook hands without fanfare. "Take care of yourself," Daniel said. "You too," Elias answered. The train carried him back across the country, away from burned hillsides, ruined farmhouses, and the smoke of destroyed vehicles. As the landscape changed from industrial towns to open plains, Elias finally saw the familiar shape of home emerging on the horizon. He stepped off the train with a small duffel bag and the quiet certainty that the war belonged to the past now. The narrator's voice settles. Elias Mercer never claimed greatness, never sought to define the moment that others would later study. But the soldiers who witnessed the ridge that morning understood the scale of what had happened. A single decision, made in the middle of uncertainty, removed a threat that pinned down an entire battalion. The shot would be spoken of in mess halls, briefing tents, and after-war gatherings, always with the same simple conclusion: no one else would have attempted it.